Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the session titled Pragmatic Clinical Trials Showcase. My name is Hubert Wong, and I'm a biostatistician with the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia and the Methods Cluster Lead for Real-World Clinical Trials at the BC Support Unit. I'll be your moderator for this session. As was discussed in the preceding session, pragmatic trials often face greater challenges than traditional trials in terms of logistics, ethical considerations, and methodology. In this session, we have 3 presentations by investigators who will share their experiences with challenges they have encountered and how these challenges were addressed in the pragmatic trials that they have been part of. These trials were selected to span a spectrum of settings from local through international to exemplify the variety of issues that may be encountered when conducting pragmatic trials. Our first presenter is Dr. Helen Novak-Lauscher, who is the Assistant Director of Research of the Digital Emergency Medicine Program at the University of British Columbia. She will share experiences from the Tech for Home heart failure trial, which is evaluating the impact of home health telemonitoring of these patients following hospital discharge. This trial was conducted in British Columbia in 19 hospitals across 3 health authorities. The trial currently is in the data analysis phase. Our second presenter is Dr. Jerry Jarvik, who is a professor of radiology and neurological surgery at the University of Washington. He will share experiences from the lumbar image reporting with epidemiology trial. The aim of this trial was to evaluate whether inserting benchmark epidemiological information for common imaging findings into lumbar spine imaging reports would reduce the use of spine-related interventions and follow-up care. This trial was conducted across integrated healthcare systems in 4 states in the United States. The primary results from this trial were published last fall in JAMA Network Open. Our third presenter is Dr. Srinivas Murthy, who is a clinical associate professor of pediatrics at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Murthy will share experiences from the CACO trial, which is the Canadian arm of the ongoing international Solidarity trial sponsored by the World Health Organization. The purpose of the Solidarity trial is to find effective treatments for individuals who have been hospitalized for COVID-19 infection. As of October 2nd, 2020, the Solidarity trial had enrolled over 12,000 patients across more than 30 countries worldwide, and additional countries are in the process of joining. Each presentation will be 20 minutes long. After the conclusion of the last presentation, there will be a 25-minute live discussion period during which the presenters will be available to respond to questions from the audience. If you have a question for a presenter, please type the name of the presenter and the question into the chat box in the conferencing app. I'll monitor the chat box and summarize the questions verbally for the presenters and the audience. Thank you, and let's begin with the first presentation.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to share our experiences with the Tech for Home Home Health Monitoring Heart Failure Project, which has been a journey of translating research into practice at the point of care. I'm presenting on behalf of our study team and Dr. Kendall Ho, PI, lead of the Digital Emergency Medicine Group and emergency physician, and my colleague Jen Cordero, research coordinator who kept everything on track. I'm a co-investigator and chair the Tech for Home Research Evaluation Committee. My talk will highlight the collaborative approach and practical considerations implementing this multi-center cross-health authority trial. I'll share insights on several areas, incorporating learnings from feasibility study to full trial, selecting the stepped wedge design, navigating harmonized ethics and privacy, site engagement and change management, ensuring relevance through engaging a patient advisory, and building distributed research capacity. In 2015, we applied for a CIHR EHIP, eHealth Innovation Partnership Program grant that funded projects that implemented and evaluated eHealth technology to support care for seniors in a real-world setting. And that is exactly what we set out to do. Tech for Home studied how home health monitoring can support the transition of care for heart failure patients from hospital to home. Here's one of my favorite photos. This is us pushing send and submitting the EHIP grant back in 2015. We were very relieved we made it in on time and kind of bemused that it all came together. I put this here to emphasize how research is not a solitary endeavor, and this initiative really brought that home for me. The importance of partnership cannot be emphasized enough as necessary to the successful implementation of this type of trial. The CIHR EHIP emphasized the development of healthcare innovation communities with industry partners to co-develop e-health solutions. So, while our UBC research team led the CIHR grant proposal, Kendall as PI really began to build this healthcare innovation community long before the grant. We partnered with TELUS Health and invited a large team of other researchers, clinicians, administrators, and patient representatives to take part, resulting in a team of over 40 people on the original grant application, so a lot of CVs to coordinate. But really, it was the beginning of a growing tech for home healthcare innovation community. Integrated knowledge translation was an imperative of the EHIP grant call and is key to a pragmatic trial. In IKT, stakeholders or potential research knowledge users are involved in the entire research process. Researchers and research users work together in every aspect of the endeavor in order to produce relevant findings. In order to maximize IKT and translate this grant application into practice, we developed 4 implementation streams: clinical, research, technology, and change management. Breaking it down this way gave us the foundation for structure, governance, and task analysis to get it all done, and to develop processes and mechanisms to connect those streams. But first, why heart failure and why home health monitoring? As an emergency physician, Kendall would often see returning patients and patients struggling to manage their heart failure condition at home after leaving the hospital. He had the idea to use home health monitoring during that transition of care from hospital to home when patients are at their most vulnerable. For heart failure patients over the age of 65, 1 in 4 will return to the emergency department within 30 days, and 4 in 10 return within 90 days. This results in frequent emergency department visits, high admission rates, long hospital stays, and high costs, both for patients and the system alike. There is, however, evidence to show that ED visits and hospitalizations can be avoided if heart failure is well managed at home by the patient in partnership with their healthcare provider. Our hypothesis was for heart failure patients, Tech for Home would decrease 90-day ED revisit rates and hospital admissions. We also hypothesized that Tech for Home would improve patient health outcomes like quality of life and self-efficacy and patient safety, improve communication between healthcare providers and patients, and be a cost-effective solution. Because our interest was this acute community transition, we recruited patients while still in the hospital or within 7 days of discharge. Once enrolled and back at home, patients were provided with home health monitoring equipment and were asked to submit daily measures, weight, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and self-report symptoms to be remotely monitored by a nurse for 60 days. We followed up 30 days after that to complete evaluation activities. Our evaluation framework was based on the Institute of Healthcare Improvement's quadruple aim, addressing patient and provider experience, health outcomes, and cost factors. The mixed method included surveys with a number of validated scales, in-depth interviews, focus groups, along with administrative and biometric data from the monitoring equipment. We struck an evaluation committee at the get-go with a diversity of disciplines and perspectives. This committee evolved to include time-bound working groups to deal with specific issues like recruitment, and is currently collaborating on analysis at the trial's close and a number of publications. Tech for Home had 2 phases. Phase 1, a feasibility study, and Phase 2, a cluster randomized control trial. Phase 1 was to test out and refine the implementation and evaluation processes, and hopefully to detect signals of potential impact. With the Phase 2 trial, we had the opportunity to collect that clear and comparative evidence to speak to the effectiveness of home health monitoring for the transition of care. One of the decisions we made early on was the structure of Phase 1. Would it be a feasibility study, which asks whether something can be done, should we proceed with it, and if so, how? Or should it be a pilot study, a smaller scale version of Phase 2? What we landed on was a bit of both. You could characterize it as neither fish nor fowl, but it was really more of a prototype study. We tested out our protocols to smooth the way for Phase 2. What we couldn't learn from Phase 1 were things like the specific needs and cultures of sites we hadn't worked with before. the scope of within and across health authority collaboration when introducing multiple sites, and the sheer scope of the distributed nature of all of the hospital sites, and how would we manage to recruit patients across so many sites, so spread out across BC. Phase 1 was open to enrollment for patient participants from 3 hospital sites, VGH, St. Paul's, and Kelowna General. For 9 months, 70 patients enrolled and completed the 60 days of monitoring. This was an open pre-post design with all participants receiving the intervention, and results were analyzed by comparing 90-day pre to 90-day post data. Our evaluation framework allowed us to collect sound data, which also showed encouraging trends. A 71% reduction in the volume of ED visits, an 87% decrease in hospital admissions, 60% reduction in the median hospital length of stay, an increase in heart failure specific quality of life and self-efficacy, and overall health system costs for our patient participants showed a 56% reduction post-monitoring. Interviews with participants found overall satisfaction with the monitoring program, usability, and they also reported being more engaged, educated, and involved in their own self-management. So all in all, very encouraging results from this feasibility study, but with some limitations, of course. The time between phase 1 and 2 was to really reflect and regroup. This meme aptly captures the difference between planning at the grant application stage and what is required as the project unfolds. Flexibility, collaborative problem solving, creativity, shared vision, strong and distributed leadership were all needed for this journey. We have recently submitted phase 1 for publication, which highlights these learnings we incorporated from phase 1 to phase 2. Phase 2 was a scale up to 22 hospital referral sites across 4 BC health authorities, with a mix of larger urban sites, regional hospital sites, and smaller rural communities. The intervention group received usual care plus 60 days of monitoring upon discharge. The control group received usual care. We recruited over 15 months, starting in August 2018, with final patients completing monitoring March 2020, just as the pandemic was declared. For phase 2, we changed course from our original plan of cluster RCT to a stepped wedge approach in which each site recruits control and intervention participants over time. One of the main challenges that this model helped us address was that of matching sites. There are a limited number of hospitals in the province. We needed to work with those who were interested and able to participate in the study. And matching on various characteristics such as population, bed size, etc., was really daunting, if not impossible. A further advantage to the stepped wedge design was that all sites are randomized as to when they switch from control to intervention. All hospital sites started by recruiting patients into the control group and then switch or step into enrolling patients into the intervention group at 3-month intervals, so that at the end of the study period, all sites offered home health monitoring to their patients. The table at the bottom of the slide is an illustration of the stepped wedge schedule. While the original target was 900 participants split across groups, the final numbers are a 109 control and 175 intervention. Of note was a pragmatic decision that was made at the beginning of step 4 in June 2019. Tech for Home, as part of a provincial home health monitoring program, was not achieving target numbers due to lower than expected enrollment. With the approval of the steering committee, we accelerated the switch to intervention for the last cluster, with both clusters 3 and 4 switching to intervention at step 4. While this created some imbalance between control and intervention groups, it allowed practical targets to be met while still meeting research objectives. Just talk a little bit about ethics, privacy, and other approvals. My colleague Jen was the superhero of ethics and approvals. Luckily, with BC's harmonized ethics process, there is only one, albeit massive, application. But there are still separate reviews and policies for each board. We quickly realized we need to accommodate varying preferences and needs to project documents, and also adapted recruitment procedures to each health authority's policies. We worked closely with the Provincial Privacy and Research Advisory Group, which helped streamline and facilitate that feedback from the 4 different groups. We surpassed our 25th amendment, no relation to that of the US Constitution, during phase 2, so a lot of agility. Operational and institutional approval processes were really moving targets, as within each site, there were multiple and changing units and changes in personnel and leadership. On site, one of our biggest challenges was keeping staff aware and interested. We used email blasts, posters, attended meetings, rounds, huddles, and also lots of chocolate. What we've learned is that success comes in many forms. We established champions, staff who were really excited about and supportive of the project, and realized that sometimes we don't only need to support the project, but sometimes we just need to make the case for research in general. We also recognized that at the point of care, we were competing against other more urgent priorities, and rightly so. Patient and family caregiver partners have been involved from initial grant application development. Our patient advisory committee had 8 members from across BC representing patients with heart failure and caregivers from urban and rural areas. Members participated in all of the different committees and working groups throughout the project, and their contributions have been essential to the success of the project. They reviewed all patient-facing materials, did run-throughs of recruitment with us, helped us train and coach research assistants and students in how best to approach and discuss the study with patients and family members, helped us develop communication materials, and co-authored publications and conference presentations. Here's a picture of the Patient Advisory Committee at our first capacity building workshop together. Another challenge we struggled with throughout was participant recruitment and enrollment into the study. This is something we found difficult at each step in the process. The first is just identifying potential participants as they come into the hospital with heart failure. We rely on staff to provide us with referrals, but cases aren't always so obvious, and Tech for Home might not always be top of mind to staff. Being in the hospital is overwhelming. No one plans to or wants to go to the emergency department. This patient population is sick, tired, and thus was challenging to get people interested. It was important to catch those who really could benefit from participating in the study as early as possible. So we continuously worked with the sites to refine those recruitment processes. Another challenge we confronted early on was how to assemble a team of research assistants, people that would be recruiting patients to staff the 22 sites across the province. We weren't looking for much, just 20 to 30 people who were skilled and responsive with a flexible schedule, able to travel to the sites, interested and engaged, with a good bedside manner, excited about research, and affordable within our research project budget. We tapped into networks and leveraged existing resources to ultimately assemble a team of research nurses who worked for other health authority units, international medical graduates, students, including a large number of volunteers and practicum students who were interested in gaining this type of experience. And while it was challenging to manage and coordinate and train this large distributed team, it was very, very rewarding to bring together a keen group, contribute to building research capacity on sites, and support students' practical learning. In rolling out an initiative like this, a team needs to remain agile, to adapt and align to changing priorities and needs. To enable that flexibility, a robust governance and operational structure was established with terms of reference for various interconnected committees. We have documented learnings about referral pathways, differing monitoring clinician models, and alignment with workflows. In reflecting on these last 4 years, a couple of lessons pop out. One, it takes teamwork. From partnerships with leadership teams to engagement sessions with frontline staff, we needed the support of everyone involved to be successful. And we're very fortunate to have this support and involvement from so many partners, particularly the commitment of health authority teams, frontline staff, and leadership. We've also learned that for research to inform practice, the practice needs to inform the research. From all of our work across the sites, we've learned to adapt our processes and leverage existing resources, which stands to help ground research findings in real-world contexts of care. Our next steps in the study include collecting the final 12-month surveys from patients, which were just sent out this December, bringing together requested administrative data and biometric data, completing integrative analysis, and working together on publishing and sharing findings. It would be impossible to name everyone who has supported this project. While we started out with 40-odd people on the grant, by the end, the number of partners and team members across all sites and organization increased by a factor of 10. This adage has never felt truer. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jerry Jarvik, and I'm going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes talking about our large pragmatic trial, the LEAR study. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk about the LEAR project. This work was funded by the NIH Healthcare Systems Collaboratory and more recently through a P30 grant through NIAMS, the NIH. I have no relevant financial disclosures directly related to this project. To cut to the chase, some of the key lessons that we learned were: 1, keep the intervention as simple as possible. 2, minimize the burden that the trial places on system partners. 3, that understanding electronic health record complexities is an iterative process that takes time to understand. 4, pragmatic interventions are often weak. And 5, as a result, pre-specified subgroup and secondary outcomes are important. The outline of my talk is as follows. I'll give a brief review of our study goals and the design of our study. I'll discuss the main results briefly and then talk about lessons learned. To begin with, I'd like to briefly discuss the NIH Healthcare Systems Collaboratory, which funded LEAR. The collaboratory was established by NIH to build the infrastructure for conducting pragmatic randomized trials, and along with PCORI, really has been the central driving force responsible for moving this paradigm of pragmatic clinical trials forward in the US. As part of that infrastructure, the collaboratory has a living textbook that does deep dives into various methods for designing and conducting pragmatic trials. They've also established a number of cores that provide expertise in relevant areas, such as a biostatistical core, a healthcare systems interaction core, an electronic health record core, and an ethics and regulatory core, as well as finally a patient-centered outcomes core. They also host weekly grand rounds on a wide range of topics related to pragmatic trials. And if you go to their website, which is rethinkingclinicaltrials.org, you can find all of these resources. Starting back in 2012, the collaboratory initially funded a round of 8 pragmatic clinical trials, one of which was our project, the LEAR study. And since then, they've continued to fund what they call demonstration projects, with a total number of funded demonstration projects now reaching 21. These demonstration projects have quite a range of both topics as well as geography, with demonstration projects recruiting participants from nearly every state in the US. Our project, the LEAR project, and I am so glad to be talking to a Francophone country, since although we called the trial LEAR partly because it was all about reading radiology reports, people in inevitably want to call it liar, something that I try not to take personally. As a medically sophisticated audience knows, lumbar spine imaging examinations are almost never normal. They frequently have a variety of findings, many of which have nothing to do with the patient's back pain. However, describing these findings in radiology reports, which is routine, likely causes concern for both clinicians and patients and can lead to unnecessary downstream healthcare use and adversely affect patient quality of life. Here are some examples of MRIs from 3 different people, none of whom had back pain. You can see a variety of findings, including disc signal loss, as evidenced by darkness on this long TR T2 weighted image. And this indicates desiccation or drying out of the disc height loss, spondylolisthesis or slippage of one vertebral body on another. So here we have a mild degree of retrolisthesis or L4 slipping back on L5. We can see disc bulges at a variety of discs with disc extending beyond the end plate, as well as a number of other findings. The problem is, without the proper context, it's hard to interpret these studies and what all of these findings actually mean. The main question that we wanted to answer was whether putting contextual information in the form of epidemiological benchmarks into routine radiology reports would provide reassurance to clinicians and patients so that they would be less likely to have unnecessary downstream back-related interventions. We intentionally designed the intervention text so that it could be readily understood by both patients and clinicians. And this is an example of one of the types of intervention texts that we inserted. We had 9 different flavors of the text, if you will, because we had 3 different imaging modalities, plain films, CT, and MRI, as well as 3 different age groups that we were targeting. So ages 18 to 39, 40 to 60, and then over the age of 60. Our primary hypothesis was that for patients referred from primary care, putting in this prevalence benchmark data into lumbar spine imaging reports would reduce overall spine-related healthcare utilization. And we used spine-related relative value units, or RVUs, as the metric for testing this hypothesis. Spine-related RVUs are a measure of spine-related interventions, and importantly for a pragmatic trial, they're available in a standardized format across health systems in the US since they're used for billing. And they could also be passively extracted from the EHR, meaning that we didn't have to resort to surveys or questionnaires, either for providers or patients. Secondary hypotheses included examining other outcomes, such as subsequent cross-sectional imaging, opioid prescriptions, spinal injections, and surgeries. We also had pre-specified subgroups that we wanted to examine, including the index test modality, whether the index test with an X-ray, MR, or CT, and whether a clinically important finding was present in the report, and whether a Lear finding was present in the report. Lear findings were one of the various findings for which we provided prevalence data in the intervention text. These are generally common findings and thought to be less clinically important. Another pragmatic aspect of the trial was our choice of randomization. Rather than parallel randomization and rather than individual randomization, we chose a cluster design with randomization at the clinic level. And we also did a stepped wedge randomization rather than a parallel randomization. Stepped wedge randomization being a one-way crossover temporal randomization. This diagram illustrates how the stepwise randomization works. At the beginning of the trial, all clusters are controls receiving unaltered radiology reports in our study. We had 5 waves. And so at the beginning of wave 1, we turned on the intervention at 1/5 of the clusters. Wave 2, we turned on another 20%. Wave 3, another 20%, and so on. So that by the end of the last wave, or the beginning of the last wave, all of the clinics are now being exposed to the intervention. And so all of the clinics have transitioned from control, illustrated by the dotted line, to intervention clinics. This design has 2 advantages. First, because at the end of the trial, everyone has the intervention. It's a way of rolling out an intervention while still rigorously studying it through randomization. Secondly, because there are 2 comparisons possible, you have the between clusters that are control and intervention, as well as the within cluster pre-post design. This design is a more efficient approach than a standard parallel design. But, and this is a big but, a disadvantage is if there is a temporal component to an outcome, it can be difficult to disentangle confounding due to external events that changed over time from the impact of the intervention, which is also changing over time. We encountered this problem with our analysis of opioid prescriptions. We saw an effect of the intervention, but there were external factors that were also working to decrease opioid prescriptions during the same time period. So best to avoid this sort of design if you anticipate the potential for temporal confounding. Okay, now on to discuss the main results of our trial. This is the consort diagram for our step wedge trial, and it looks different than for a standard parallel design. Here, the control clinics and patients are in gray, and the intervention clinics and patients are in blue. And I think this nicely illustrates how over time, more of the study population is exposed to the intervention, and that by the end of the study, all the clusters are intervention. The final sample size, there were 117,000 controls and about 121,000 intervention patients for a total of about 238,000 patients that we analyzed for the study. This is our table 1, which shows that the randomization seems to have worked well with the groups pretty balanced with respect to demographics, comorbidity, and insurance status. These again are things that we could easily measure from the data that we extracted from the EHR. We showed no difference between controls and intervention groups for our primary outcome, spine-related RVUs. However, for one of our pre-specified subgroup analyses, which was by index imaging modality, there was in fact a difference by the index test. We did not find a difference by image finding type, whether it was a clinically important finding or whether there was a Lear finding contained within the text. For our pre-specified secondary outcome of opioid prescriptions, there was a small, but statistically significant lower rate of prescriptions for the intervention group compared with the control group, giving an odds ratio of 0.95 and a p-value of 0.02. So, what did we learn from this study? Well, there were a number of challenges that we faced. There were technical implementation challenges for the intervention, and these challenges differed by healthcare systems. different healthcare systems took different approaches towards implementation. Some used the radiology information system, some the electronic health record system, most of which were on the Epic platform. And these different approaches required different programmer groups. And even for systems that were using the EHR for implementation, even if they had the same EHR Epic, they may have used, and some did use, different modes to display the intervention. So pop-up alerts versus static text that was always there within the report. So we had to take those differences into account for implementation. Also, as something that we learned to be aware of or beware of were upgrades. For example, one of our systems had a radiology information system upgrade that actually broke the implementation so that the intervention text was no longer being inserted into the reports. We learned the importance of pilot testing implementations at all sites. Since even though it might seem that one site is similar to another, there might be important differences that affect implementation that only become apparent once you actually try it. We also learned the importance of regular monitoring to identify problems such as the breakage in the radiology information system that we discovered. The non-technical challenges actually may be even more important than the technical ones. At one site, some of the radiologists just didn't believe in the importance of the intervention, nor in the need to study it. So initially simply refused to include it in their reports. Others, and this was more common, wanted to be able to remove the intervention text when they thought that it was not relevant, for example, for a post-op follow-up imaging examination. So even though we had the buy-in from leadership, the troops on the ground may not have always agreed with what the leadership wanted. Nevertheless, we were able to overcome these hurdles by working closely with the leaders in the healthcare system through our site PIs. We're able to get these trusted individuals to convince local docs to play along. Finally, healthcare systems are not static entities, but they're constantly changing, sometimes by design and sometimes not. For example, two sites define clinics by providers, or essentially designating virtual clinics. Since providers come and go from systems, we need to be constantly updating our provider lists. One site actually changed their EHR vendor, and we had to also deal with the ICD-9 to ICD-10 transition. So all sorts of changes are occurring constantly within healthcare systems. We also learned that merging data from different systems was more challenging than we anticipated. One good choice that we made was to have chosen integrated care organizations to minimize follow-up problems. Again, all our follow-up was passive based on EHR queries, but because we chose good partners, we were able to follow nearly everyone with only 9 of about 250,000 of the randomized patients not having follow-up data. So just to emphasize the difficulty in merging data from multiple systems, it's not only which codes are used, but just as importantly, how people within the systems are deciding which codes to assign for procedure or diagnosis. They may vary with respect to specificity, number of levels that they're coding, or details about approach, or even the type of code that's used, CPT versus ICD procedure code, for example. And you need to be aware of these idiosyncratic practices and discover them so that you can address them. So in summary, some of the key lessons that we learned are keep the intervention as simple as possible, minimize the burden on system partners, understand EHR complexities and that this is going to be an iterative process, that pragmatic interventions are often weak, and that pre-specified subgroup and secondary outcomes are important. course, the most important lesson is work with great people. You may not be able to choose your family, but you can choose your research family. And I was quite fortunate to have worked with a fabulous team of collaborators. So choose wisely. Thanks very much for your attention.
Hi, my name is Srinivas Murthy, and I'm here to talk on the Pragmatic Trials Forum. I'll be speaking on the Solidarity Trial, which is a WHO-sponsored study, and specifically the Canadian Treatments for COVID-19, the CATCO study, which is under the umbrella of the World Health Organization. My name is Srinivas Murthy. I'm here at the University of British Columbia. Thank you for the invitation. Some financial disclosures. I do receive salary support from the Health Research Foundation and Innovative Medicines Canada as the chair in pandemic preparedness research here at the University of British Columbia. So going back in time, it's been quite a year now, it seems. And so this was back in early January, late December, a year ago, where the first isolates of the coronavirus were determined. Since then, obviously, we've learned quite a bit, but in the clinical trial community, we've definitely learned a substantial amount about how to optimize learning during a pandemic and after this pandemic is finished. So going back in time to those scary and chaotic first few weeks in January, when at least the clinical research community was trying to figure out exactly what to do and how best to do it. These are research trials underway in China during those first few weeks, where there was dozens and dozens of independent clinical trials being done across those first chaotic days of the pandemic, upwards of hundreds of trials being registered on a weekly basis in China. A couple of those trials were highly well done and managed to change practice around the world, as demonstrated in these two examples of Kaletra and remdesivir. Of note, these were initiated within days of the virus being isolated, and the trials were recruiting very rapidly during those first few days. What we needed to do around the world is to answer questions about how to best manage these patients. And to do that, we needed to achieve a sample size to definitively answer questions. I think we all knew that answering questions in small, scattered ways would not provide the definitive answers required to manage this global pandemic. Our solution to that was international coordination. Second problem here was to implement a Health Canada regulated study during a pandemic. As a novel disease, obviously there's no drug with an indication to treat this disease, and so all drug trials for COVID-19 would have to be regulated by Health Canada. So as much as possible, we would have to simplify study processes to make these as pragmatic and simple to implement at the bedside as possible, acknowledging that everybody, from patients to clinicians, are extraordinarily pressured and stressed. And the third problem is that during a pandemic, clinicians just want to treat. We have all heard the stories of hydroxychloroquine or convalescent plasma, and the default practice is to give medications rather than to test them. And our solution to that was to make a study available and to educate and to integrate learning into pandemic response as much as possible. So going back to our study, builds on this principle that multiple small trials with different methodologies would not give us the clear and strong evidence we need about which treatments help to save lives. And so back in March, through conversations with the World Health Organizations, this trial was initiated as a global, pragmatic, adaptive trial to look for treatments for COVID-19 amongst hospitalized patients. In Canada, we sort of are running it as a daughter type study with its own independent sponsor, called the Canadian Treatments for COVID-19 study, but it's definitively integrated with the global study itself. And that's been recruiting since March around the world in over 40 countries and almost 500 hospitals. And so from that perspective, it's been a token of collaboration and coordination across a very stressful time for the world. Across the world, it's been, alongside our colleagues in the United Kingdom, some of the largest, most definitive trials to really learn what works and what doesn't work. Effectively, what it's proposed is that we need these large adaptive studies coordinated across hospital sites and networks, and ideally across countries, to evaluate and produce high quality evidence for practice. Going back to why we're here, to learn about pragmatic trials, and there's lots of definitions as to what they are, like taking them as examining interventions in a broad population, i.e. those who will be treated should have it evaluated. I see them as reporting outcomes of importance for patients. In our context, it's whether you live or die after being admitted to the hospital. And it's very pragmatic in that it's compared to standard therapies, and so what patients would otherwise be getting. And so it's an additive benefit to provide data for effectiveness in the world in which the treatment would be available. The challenge with drug trials and making them pragmatic is that it adds an extra level of complexity to the implementation of it. We all have heard about pragmatic studies evaluating, say, comparative effectiveness interventions where no drugs are involved, but more processes of care, which can be very, or at least more readily embedded within practice. With drug trials, where there's a regulator providing oversight and possibly new risks and safety monitoring required, the word pragmatic has often been seen as being difficult to integrate into these types of studies. Specifically in Canada, at least, and then every country has their own regulator who provides specific needs for new drugs and their evaluation in clinical trials. And so things like a long, typically consent with long lists of explanations as to what can be expected and not within the context of a clinical trial. GCP, or good clinical practice training, is required typically for everyone related to the study. And so one can envision a pragmatic study which is embedded within care with nurses across the spectrum and clinicians having to inform GCP training for all of those individuals would be an added layer of complexity. Things like temperature monitoring of drugs that otherwise would not be present. Things like need for a research pharmacy, and then a log of every activity of delegated tasks, which wouldn't be done in typical clinical practice, but is being done for the purposes of the trial. And so when you have a clinician who has a drug available to them and has 2 patients, one of which gets the drug as part of routine care, and the other one gets the drug as part of a randomized clinical trial, the same drug and the same patient profile. The latter patient requires a large number of tasks to be performed to make sure that it satisfies needs of oversight and regulation. And so as a clinician, one would more often than not default to the easiest pathway, which is the pathway typically that learning is not accomplished. And we don't appreciate the effectiveness or safety of a specific intervention. This isn't meant to criticize the need for oversight and regulations, but it is there to acknowledge that from a clinical perspective, the default of giving the medication rather than learning from giving the medication needs to be thought about. I point back to this wonderful editorial in JAMA by a close colleague, Derek Angus, from back in the spring about optimizing the trade-off between learning and doing during a pandemic. And he emphasizes two specific problems, namely one, randomization is uncomfortable for clinicians in explaining that concept to patients, and two, randomized clinical trials are cumbersome based on all of the things we have just spoken about. The third feature is not a problem, is that what we've learned, especially during this pandemic, is that randomization is fundamental for that causal inference. And the disconnect between even high quality observational methods and randomization data has been profound during this pandemic. And so to learn what works and what doesn't work, the need for randomization is clear. Solutions proposed in this piece were, one, to make randomization more comfortable. And what that means is taking novel approaches, and say if a clinician feels like something works but does not know that for sure, integrating novel innovative strategies such as response adaptive randomization, where the better performing arm within the trial typically gets more preferential allocation of the intervention. Make randomization simpler. And so it's not a huge number of documents to integrate into care. It's a very straightforward couple of buttons to hit to see if a patient can be randomized. Sacrificing the sacred cows of research, and this is the placebo double-blinded study. It's not required to see what the real world effectiveness of a specific intervention is, and casting a big tent, namely trying to collaborate and coordinate across regions and borders. For clinical systems, embedding research into care. And we'll talk about some of the things that we can do from a systems perspective to accomplish that. To embrace unknowns and humility. I think we as clinicians like to think that we know many things, and we write guidelines and recommendations to emphasize those facts, when in fact most of our recommendations and most of our decisions are not based on the highest quality of evidence. And to embrace that unknown and embrace that with our patients, and take the random decisions that are made in clinical practice and randomize them. And engage patients in these discussions throughout to acknowledge where the unknowns are and to learn from them as much as possible. This classic sort of siloed approach of research and care ideally can be overcome, and so that research with and care can be integrated as much as possible. And this obviously requires somewhat of a culture change in clinical practice, but it's a culture change that's both overdue and I think both long accepted as needed by many clinicians. It's just been the cumbersome nature of randomized trials that's been the obstacle. I don't want to single out one regulator specifically, and this is a concept that regulators typically want over clinical trials, but acknowledging that modernizing the approach to make sure that research and care are integrated for the betterment of patients is the ultimate goal. And so what we needed to do, going back to those original slides to get our study up and running, is solution one is international coordination. Integrating with the World Health Organization was the best approach there. As simple a study as possible. And so very straightforward data collection, very simple approaches and consenting processes, and then educating as much as possible, disseminating the idea that a study is the best way of learning during a pandemic. And so this is what our initial proposal was in the solidarity approach, whereby patients who are hospitalized were randomized to one of those 5 arms with the primary outcome of hospital mortality. 3 of those arms have subsequently been dropped since then after declaring futility. One of them, remdesivir, continues to be randomized at the time of me giving this presentation. And we have since published in November of last year our interim results in the New England Journal of Medicine showing no significant benefit for any of these 4 agents. And we're continuing as described to look at remdesivir. One highlight and one need to sort of emphasize the need for pragmatic clinical studies is that there's been a large deal of conversations about the difference between the phase 3 study performed in the United States for remdesivir and our sort of pragmatic real-world study, both in terms of differences in length of stay, mortality, and need for ventilation. And I think they're not inconsistent results, and they entirely make sense based on the nature of how clinicians provide care and the need to keep patients in for giving a treatment that they feel might have benefit, but when in fact it did not on the important and non-modifiable outcomes of mortality and the need for ventilation. I want to highlight in the last couple of minutes about the future, about how these platform trials that are pragmatic can make us work towards an idea of a learning health system. I'll go back to the idea that one, the need for randomization within care is absolutely fundamental to get that learning be robust and have it be solid. And the idea of integrating randomizations into care is an exciting one, but obviously comes with a great deal of complexity. We're lucky enough in the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to get some funding more recently to try and integrate COVID-19 trials as much as possible. And coordinate all of the trials and embed them as much as possible within a common platform and common data sharing elements. And so this is one example alongside the solidarity approach. This is a randomized embedded multifactorial adaptive platform trial, primarily in the critically ill. And this platform trial, which studies not specifically a treatment for a disease, but rather a disease with new treatments coming into the platform perpetually, so that we're constantly improving the outcomes of those patients with that disease, is sort of the model of a learning health system. And we're hoping to integrate platform trials across the spectrum of illness. This is specific for COVID-19, but there's a lot of opportunity to build this sort of infrastructure post-COVID-19. A lot of this is meant to break down silos between researchers where individual trials need to be set up and scaled out and contracts signed, and the logistics and time and inefficiencies therein. A platform trial where all of these individual trials are all on one system thereby sort of overcomes all of that, and we're able to learn in a much more efficient and practical way. There are questions, obviously, for embedding platform trials into health systems, and the models of consent is one. There are novel ideas of integrated consent into care. That does not work according to Division 5 for regulated studies, and that's a conversation that's ongoing. Data linkages for outcome assessments. The NIHR in the UK, with their outstanding recovery trial, has managed to get outcomes through their administrative data directly linked to the clinical trial in real time. In Canada, that's many steps away across jurisdictions, across provinces, but it's something that hopefully we can work towards. The embedding of the research within the clinical EHR is another sort of, not pie in the sky, but a short, medium-term goal, where within the EHR, while a patient is being cared for, a randomization can conceivably appear as a patient is eligible for a specific study. There are a number of health systems that have these concepts integrated into their care pathways. How registration trials, namely trials of novel drugs or off-label drugs, are integrated into this learning health system will be complicated. Many industry trials want to have control and want to have specific outcomes assessed, and integrating them into a larger platform of knowledge generation adds added complexities. I think overall, to conclude, pragmatic trials and unapproved drugs come with added complications for implementation, particularly during a global pandemic. I would say they're required, though, to prove effectiveness in real world settings, and truthfully are the future. Thank you. My email and Twitter handle is there, and I thank the organizers for the invitation.
Are we live, Naomi? Okay, great. So on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank our presenters, Helen, Jerry, and Srin, for their interesting presentations. I think all of us are very interested in hearing about specifics of what happens in these pragmatic trials, and now we have some ideas to what is going on. Now, I've been informed that this session is going to be extended for about 10 minutes to account for starting late. So we'll go a little bit past noon in the session. But also, Jerry needs to leave right at noon. So if people have questions for Jerry, I'd like to get those asked first. Now, I did have one question maybe to start it off for Jerry. And we all have heard that today, the overall theme of today's sessions is about how we can embed pragmatic trials within a learning health system. And so part of what we have to do there is to engage the policy and decision makers to ensure that the trial addresses the goals and priorities of the healthcare system. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of elaborate on what sort of processes and activities that you undertook to make your trials successful. Were there carrots that you offered the decision makers to engage them, or I don't know if you had any sticks to wield in sort of situation, but.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Hubert. No, we certainly didn't have any sticks, and unfortunately, we didn't think ahead and have chocolate to distribute freely, like I think it was Helen that mentioned. But also as Helen mentioned, partnership was key, and for us, it's really started with existing relationships. I'm hearing an echo. I don't know if other people are hearing that as well. But we initially turned to partners with whom we had previously collaborated on a variety of projects, and we built on prior shared experiences and trust that really existed between our research group and the healthcare delivery systems that we were dealing with. And then frequently it wasn't the site PI who was our primary contact that was necessarily the healthcare system leader or decision maker, but it was through that site PI that we used their trusted position within their healthcare system to access their leadership because they're the ones that had the pre-established relationships, not us. And so it was this network that we had developed over time that for us was a key, I think, to our success.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. We have a question for Helen from Cindy Triton. Cindy says that leadership was obviously critical to the success of this trial. And she's wondering, from your perspective, what are sort of the key leadership attributes that you need to call upon in order to make this work?
Thanks, Cindy, for the great question. And I think just really reflects what Jeffrey just said around the relationships and trust as being foundational. But I would say leadership that recognizes that it's underpinned by those relationships and enables. I think I've been reflecting on this in my background as educational psychology scholar. And really that, I think that mechanism is perspective taking, which leads to empathy. So, you know, there's the things like leadership that seeks consensus, focuses on shared big picture goals, and openly addresses issues of power within any of those tables. And I think another kind of key feature is that distributed leadership that raises up, but also depends on each member's lived experience, expertise, and knowledge. So whether that's a volunteer recruiter, that's a student that's helping on site and has a particular set of experiences and sits at a table, or whether that's health authority leadership. And I think leadership at every level that enabled sort of it's okay to ask questions, which I think comes back to Jeffrey's point about trust. It's okay to learn, it's preferable to learn, and it's okay not to be the expert in everything. And I think that enables that distributed leadership.
Follow up on that, Helen. I mean, there's the leadership aspect to it. I wonder how that plays into, how do you engage all of these different stakeholder groups to make sure that you're addressing their concerns? I mean, different groups have different ideas as to what's important. So what did you guys do to make sure that people are happy or satisfied with what you're doing?
I guess it's, I'll reflect on sort of, it's that big picture sort of theoretical piece that I mentioned about how do you enable through relationships that ability to not just understand someone else's perspective from whatever sector they represent, but to be able to hear and enact it. I think that it's so that theoretical kind of big picture piece, which is a philosophy sort of side, but also how does that play out in how you organize the project. And I think having like a series of tables from the steering committee and governance down to each of those working groups that have that representation. I think one practical example would be like the patient advisory committee members were on each of those other committees. So in terms of the research and evaluation, that having that multi-perspective working group, so to speak, enabled us to hash those things out. So really having that thread throughout, whether it was at a high level steering governance or whether it was at a working group level.
You know, Hubert, if I can just add to that, you know, in our experience with the LEAR trial, you know, we were very much aware that the communication set up between our study project leadership and the healthcare systems leadership had to be a two-way street. And that it's not only us expressing to them what the goals were of the project, but of course it's us listening to them and giving them the power really to have input into our study. And of course this has to start from the very earliest stages, thinking about the questions to ask and the appropriate study design, et cetera. And, you know, empowering their leadership to impact our study, of course, makes what we're doing more relevant to the healthcare system and increases the likelihood of success.
Okay, great. I have a question, I believe it's directed at Srin. How did the multinational team control for differences in treatment regimes other than the drug under investigation? So, patients are very, very heterogeneous and they're receiving different types of care in different countries.
Yeah, and I think from a sort of a pragmatic trial perspective, variations in baseline standard of care across large regions and centers is a huge sort of issue that everyone thinks about a lot without really a clear good answer, so to speak. I think it boils down to numbers, in that if you are able to achieve adequate numbers of randomizations, small variations in baseline differences across different parts of the world and standards of care could probably be overcome, probably. That is always going to be a criticism of these large trials if the standard of care is different in a variety of different places. And then from a causal pathway perspective, one has to think of if a drug is useful with this standard of care but not useful with that standard of care, is there a mediator somewhere that's sort of going to drive that? And so looking at subgroups, looking at regions, and then sort of unpacking whether there's anything important there from a baseline care perspective. But it's a great question, unable to answer in a sort of useful way for the listener or viewer.
All right, thank you. Do you want to comment a little bit more generally on how well has sort of the adaptive design worked, and what's your general feelings about the appropriateness or value of using them in pragmatic trials? I mean, if you go back to the talks yesterday, I mean, there were several talks about adaptive trials, but they were looking at situations where it's like the phase 2 kinds of studies where you're just trying to develop the intervention, but here we're actually evaluating a preset intervention. So do you think there's differences, or do you think there's no difference?
No, I think there's a sizable difference. I think from a phase 2 approach, adapting a study based on dose, based on some biological criteria makes a ton of sense, and it's easier to implement. Say you're doing it at a number of hospitals or one sort of region, you get one ethics board to adapt, no contracts or so on. When working on these multinational pragmatic adaptations, trying to keep everything in sync as it relates to adaptations becomes logistically very cumbersome. And so one can envision different parts of the world adapting at different times because of sort of the hurdles on adapting. And then the statistical rules about all the things we spoke of just in the last question about differences in regions and baseline standards of care, and is an adaptation that's useful in one place relevant for every other place. And so once again, I'm going to fall back on large numbers and the importance therein to definitively say that something is good to adapt and good to integrate. But I will say that there's a huge amount of logistical challenges with these large-scale adaptive pragmatic studies. A lot of them can be overcome. A lot of them are policy challenges rather than scientific ones. But I think that those are clear and we need to acknowledge them head on.
Okay, great. We have a question from Sterling Bryan. Are we in the business of culture change in healthcare? Okay.
Who's that for?
Well, it's for whoever wishes to speak.
I think everybody who's in any role in healthcare could possibly play a role as it relates to change, and change in healthcare reflects the culture change. And so, yes, I would say that is important, and we all play that role either as a leader or as a follower or someone in between. to help drive change to make things improve. Recognizing that change is important is obviously the first step.
Yeah, and I'd certainly agree with that. I remember when I was first starting out, and I was in the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program. They like to tell us that they were training us to be change agents, and of course, changing culture is an incredibly difficult thing to do, it's something that I think we've probably been working at for most of our careers to try and get things to change in the healthcare system and to get people to recognize the importance of randomization. As Srini was emphasizing in his talk, is a monumental step, but important. Nothing profound there.
I think approaching this sort of from a context of digital health and sort of that context of technology adoption and digital health literacy, I think there's a layer of culture change on the surface that we always speak to. But I think, yeah, it's deeper than that. And I think in terms of being able to embrace that social accountability piece, so have participation from all of the sectors and be able to address issues of power. I think we will change culture, whether it's our business or not. It's part of being part of this larger system, and embracing the positive of it is what we can do.
Okay, thank you, everyone. There is one more question from Alicia Murdoch, and I think maybe Helen's already addressed it to some extent, but maybe if you want to give a little bit more detail about the specific types of capacity building that you did with patient representatives.
Well, we had some formal and some informal things. So I guess it was the first thing to sort of say is it was capacity building in what we offered as researchers or clinicians in terms of, having a big workshop where we got together to know each other back in the day when we could eat together and sit around a table. So really that building those relationships, but, doing the methodology piece, learning about the context of this study, the heart failure, what the clinical workflows were like. So that kind of capacity building that we were all doing. But then obviously around the sectors of that partnership pentagram, each sector helped build capacity in the others. So while we may say this was a capacity building couple of days workshop that we did with our patient committee, it wasn't so much about capacity building in research methods and how to participate, but it was capacity building for that entire group. But yeah, practical things, and then being parts of those committees, we learned together. So yeah, it was a good process.
All right. There was another question from Danielle Lavalley for Jerry. The pragmatic aspects of changing electronic health records and infrastructure highlights a challenge of embedded research and leveraging routinely collected data. So have you changed how you plan studies to account for this in other studies or plans?
Well, thanks, Danielle, for that question. Probably as well as anybody, the sweat and toil that we put into the project to try and harmonize these health records from different healthcare systems, and it was not trivial. As far as forward thinking and what we can anticipate in the future, the first step is awareness and realizing that it's not simple, even if healthcare systems are using the same EHR system. Everybody's moving towards Epic these days, but of course, they say you've seen one instance of Epic, you've seen one instance of Epic. Even though things appear similar, there are differences once you start to look under the hood, and so I think that for your primary outcome variable, you want to make sure that you have a good handle on that and do a lot of pilot testing with the healthcare systems with whom you're planning to work to make sure that you can derive that, if you're going to derive it passively from the EHR. Pre-specify things as much as possible and test them out. I think that maybe is the biggest lesson that we've learned. I'm sure others have faced this issue as well. Chime in if they'd like.
All right. There are no more questions, but I'd like to offer the speakers one last chance to say anything that they would like.
I guess I'll say, from a learning health system perspective, we always say that clinical trials are sort of separate research-based initiatives that need to be funded independently and go through a research approval process, and ours have its own infrastructure, and clinical care has its own infrastructure. And I think we're all here today to try and figure out how clinical trials can become sort of more merged with that clinical care approach. And there are complexities there, obviously. But I think we can get there. I think there's the policy things we spoke of, but also the culture things. And that question about whether we're in the business of culture change, I think that's why we're having this meeting right now, to start having these conversations more broadly.
I can't think of a better note to finish on, an optimistic note.
And I agree. Thank you, Srin. So with that final comment, I'll close the session, and I hope to see you later in the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.